At his peak, one man controlled 90% of the oil in America. When the government finally broke his company apart to stop him, something strange happened. He didn't get poorer, he got richer. This is the story of John D. Rockefeller, a man raised by a con artist who grew up to become the most hated businessman in the country and the first person in history to be worth $1 billion. Part 1. The Education of a Cold Boy. John D. Rockefeller was born in 1839 in upstate New York, into a household split right down the middle. His mother was deeply religious, careful with money, and believed in doing things honestly. His father was neither honest nor around very often. Locally, people knew him as Devil Bill, a man who claimed to be a traveling salesman but actually made his living conning people. He sold fake medicine to desperate, dying customers. He'd pretend to be unable to speak so people would talk freely in front of him, then use whatever secrets he overheard against them later. He treated his own children with the same philosophy. There's a well-known story, likely softened by time, but consistent in spirit, about him telling young John to jump off a piece of furniture, promising to catch him, then stepping aside and letting him fall, with a simple lesson attached: don't trust anyone completely, not even your own father. Whether or not that exact moment happened the way it's remembered, it captures something true about how John grew up: cautious, guarded, and drawn to the one thing in his life that never lied to him: numbers. By his teens, John was essentially running his household. He took a short bookkeeping course, landed a job as a junior clerk, and became almost obsessively precise about tracking every cent he earned or spent in a personal ledger he kept for years. By 20, pure discipline had gotten him a small amount of savings, but not enough to start a real business. So he swallowed his pride and borrowed money from his own father, who charged him interest anyway, just to keep him sharp. With that money, John partnered with an older, more cautious businessman, and the two of them opened a produce trading firm. It was stable, it was safe. And then, in 1859, oil was discovered in Pennsylvania, and everything changed. Part 2. The Auction That Made Him. While his business partner wanted to stay in food, John saw where the future was actually heading. Not in what people ate, but in what let them see after dark. Oil meant light, and light was something everyone would always need. Against his partner's better judgment, they brought in a skilled chemist and built a small refinery. But the partnership itself couldn't survive John's appetite for risk. He wanted to expand aggressively. His partner wanted caution. And by 1865, the disagreement had become impossible to bridge. They agreed to split, with the refinery going to whichever of them could outbid the other at auction. The bidding climbed steadily, a few $1,000s, then more, until his partner, confident a 25-year-old couldn't possibly go higher, offered a number he assumed would end it. John didn't blink. He kept bidding until the number was more than double that, and his partner finally gave up. Years later, Rockefeller would call that single auction the moment that decided the rest of his career. Now fully in charge, he turned the same obsessive precision he'd once used on his personal ledger onto the refinery itself. At the time, most refiners only cared about producing kerosene and simply dumped the rest of what came out of crude oil, gasoline, tar, other byproducts, straight into nearby rivers. Rockefeller looked at that waste and saw money being thrown away. He found ways to sell almost everything that came out of a barrel of oil, cut out middlemen wherever he could, built his own barrel-making operation, and used the savings to consistently underprice every competitor in Cleveland. By 30, he owned the largest refinery in what was, at the time, the oil capital of the world. Most people would have stopped there. He didn't. Standing above a city full of small, competing refineries, he didn't see rivals. He saw fragments of an industry waiting to be organized into one machine, with himself at the controls. Part 3. The Machine. In 1870, Rockefeller and a small group of partners formally created the Standard Oil Company. His plan wasn't just to out-refine his competitors. It was to control the very thing they all depended on to move their product, the railroads. He approached the railroad companies with an offer nobody else could match: a guaranteed, massive, steady volume of oil shipped every single day, in exchange for a secret arrangement. That arrangement gave Rockefeller a steep discount on his own shipping costs, detailed intelligence on exactly what his competitors were shipping and where, and the sharpest part of the deal, a cut of the shipping fees his rivals paid, handed directly to him. Armed with information most business owners could never access, and costs most of them couldn't match, Rockefeller made his rivals a simple offer: sell your refinery to Standard Oil now, for cash or company stock, or try to survive against numbers you can't compete with. Most sold. In under 3 months, the overwhelming majority of Cleveland's refineries belonged to him. When the secret arrangement eventually leaked, the public backlash was fierce enough to get the deal legally dismantled within months. But by then, it didn't matter. Rockefeller had already gotten what he needed. He simply kept expanding, this time using a strategy nobody had really used at that scale before: buying up the barrel makers, the warehouses, and the chemical suppliers his rivals depended on, so that even refiners who wanted to stay independent found themselves unable to get the basic materials to operate. When a group of Pennsylvania oilmen tried to build a massive independent pipeline to bypass his railroads entirely, Rockefeller fought them with lawsuits, land purchases designed to block construction, and relentless legal and financial pressure, until the exhausted, bankrupt builders sold him the finished pipeline for a fraction of its worth. By 1879, John D. Rockefeller controlled roughly 90% of oil refining in the United States. Part 4. The Ghost in the Machine. Owning nearly an entire industry created a new problem. At the time, American law didn't actually allow a company to own stock in businesses across multiple states, which meant Standard Oil's sprawling empire technically shouldn't have been able to exist as one unified thing. So Rockefeller's lawyers invented something new: a legal structure called a trust, which pulled the stock of dozens of separate companies into a single entity controlled by a small handful of trustees. On paper, it was almost impossible to pin down who actually owned what. If a regulator asked who controlled a particular refinery, the honest answer led through a maze of paperwork that never quite arrived anywhere. From behind that structure, Rockefeller kept applying the same relentless attention to detail that had defined him since his bookkeeping days, famously obsessing over tiny efficiencies, like the precise amount of solder needed to seal a kerosene container, because even a fraction of a cent saved, multiplied across millions of units, added up to a fortune. He also expanded well beyond the United States, flooding markets across Asia with cheap kerosene, and in some regions, giving away simple oil lamps for free. Because once someone owned a lamp, they needed to keep buying fuel for it. The price of kerosene dropped dramatically worldwide, and for the first time in history, ordinary people in many parts of the world could afford to have light after dark. By the 1890s, Rockefeller's personal fortune was worth an almost unbelievable share of the entire American economy. But the same intensity that built his empire had visibly worn him down. He developed a condition that caused significant hair loss, wore wigs to compensate, and had grown physically frail, living for years on an extremely limited, careful diet. Part 5. The Reckoning. While Rockefeller was becoming more reclusive, a journalist named Ida Tarbell, whose own father had been driven out of the independent oil business years earlier, spent years building a meticulous, exhaustive public record of exactly how Standard Oil had really operated. The secret railroad deals, the crushed competitors, the whole machine laid out in detail for the first time. Her reporting also surfaced an old, uncomfortable fact Rockefeller had spent decades trying to bury. His father, the same con man who'd once vanished on the family, was still alive, living under a false identity, married to another woman while technically still married to Rockefeller's mother. For a man who'd built his entire public image around discipline and respectability, it was devastating. The public reaction was intense enough to give a young, ambitious president the political momentum to act. In 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly and ordered it broken apart into more than 30 separate companies. Corporations that would eventually become household names like Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron. At 72 years old, most people assumed Rockefeller had finally lost. He hadn't. He still owned substantial stock in every single one of the new companies. And freed from the legal baggage of the old trust, the value of those individual shares climbed even faster than the original company's stock had. By 1916, as the world shifted from oil lamps to automobiles, John D. Rockefeller officially became the world's first billionaire. In his final decades, Rockefeller spent enormous effort and enormous money rebuilding his public image, funding universities and medical research that helped eliminate diseases that had killed millions. Whether that was genuine guilt, a real change of heart, or simply the last and most successful deal of his life, is something historians still argue about. What isn't up for argument is the scale of what he built and the uncomfortable lesson underneath it. Sometimes even breaking up an empire doesn't actually break the man who built it.
If you made it this far, you already know this story is bigger than one man. There are more of them. There always are. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.